The book of Isaiah that we have now is really a collection of 3 books. The first book was mostly written by the prophet known as Isaiah of Jerusalem. Isaiah of Jerusalem lived somewhere around between the 8th and early 7th centuries BCE and is responsible for much of chapters 1 through 39. Today's reading comes from, that we heard Meg read, comes from what's known as Second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah. And it was written more likely by an unknown prophet somewhere at the tail end of the captivity of the Jews in Babylon, and somewhere written around the second half of the 5th century BCE. And this includes chapters 40 to 55. And finally, we're not going to be talking about it, but just so I can complete the trilogy here, Third Isaiah is the rest of the book, chapters 55 through 66. It's most likely written after the captivity, after the Jews had come back to the land. They all reflect different perspectives. But today's reading that I want to look at for a moment or two comes from Second Isaiah. And in Second Isaiah, he speaks of the servant of the Lord. The servant is a person, someone who is honored, but also someone who is shamed and treated violently. This violence has a positive outcome. By his bruises, we are healed. So in the eyes of God, the servant is great and will make many people righteous or just. Christian interpretation has it that this servant is Jesus. And this belief goes back to at least the New Testament, perhaps even earlier. But if we beam ourselves back using our educated imaginations to the time when Second Isaiah was writing, and try to imagine ourselves into the world of this ancient prophet or his ancient audience, original audience, saying that the servant is Jesus is a little more problematic. Those hearing this at the time of the exile, it wouldn't have made any sense to them at all. Who are you talking about? Identifying who the servant is a tricky question, and there is really no consensus within scholarship. There have been many suggestions. Some people have argued that Second Isaiah himself is the prophet, that the writer is writing about himself, or that it refers to some other great prophet. It could refer to Cyrus, who was the king of Persia, who granted the Jews the right to return back to their homeland. So he was honored. Some have said that it refers to Moses, and the list goes on. Some believe the servant is a teacher, others a priest, others a prophet. There are some that don't believe that the servant is really even an individual, but rather is a community, perhaps all or part of Israel. Now, it's not likely that I'm going to settle this huge controversy in a short sermon, but that's not going to stop me from trying. So I think, personally, this is my take on this debated issue. I think the suffering servant is probably all these things and more. The suffering servant is not written as a direct description of Jesus, but I would argue that Jesus is a suffering servant. And we all are suffering servants at some times, at some points. So I suspect that the suffering servant is a poetic description of what we are all called to be. It's a description of Israel. It's also a description of Moses, the prophets, even Second Isaiah. It describes them all, but is not exclusive to any of them. We are all potentially the suffering servant. We have all called to be someone important, although perhaps not in ways that our culture would recognize. We have all been called to be honored, yet we all have experienced shame and sometimes have been treated violently. Now, as members of our modern world, as citizens of Canada, we have been trained since our birth to think in very individualistic terms. And there are some good things about this, and there's some bad things. Some of the good, for example, is it's helpful to break from a group mind if you're thinking as an individual. And sometimes a group mind isn't the best mind. But it can make it difficult to enter into the worldview of the ancient Hebrew and New Christian scriptures too. Because Isaiah wrote as one embedded in a collectivist society, not an individualistic society. He was not a rugged individualist. And so if we approach the text thinking in those terms, we're going to miss his point. When it comes to suffering, sometimes when we think of suffering, we think about it in individualistic terms. We think about my suffering, your suffering, her suffering, his suffering, what have you. But if we try to imagine ourselves into a collectivist mentality, which was something that the ancient world and some parts of the modern world exist in today, but certainly the ancient world, then it's easier to imagine that anyone's suffering is everyone's suffering. If we can get past our egos, we might see that all suffering is all of a piece. If we're all connected, then the suffering of one is the suffering of the whole. It's only when we don't see ourselves as being connected that it's hard to think like that. This servant that Isaiah writes about takes the suffering of others upon himself, and this makes others righteous or just. Christians in our liturgy and in our theology regularly confess that through the suffering of Christ, a door is opened to us to a more truer form of existence, a more authentic way of living, that our lives are better because of Jesus' suffering. Trying to understand exactly all the nuts and bolts on how this works isn't easy. So there is a bigger challenge in 2nd Isaiah, a bigger challenge than trying to identify who the servant is. The bigger challenge is seeing and perhaps accepting that suffering really is part and parcel of life. And that this is especially true for those who rock the boat, those who challenge the status quo, something that Jesus certainly did, but something that Isaiah also did. Those who speak truth to power, those who risk their own well-being so that others might come into a better life. Now, whether it makes sense intellectually or not, I believe experience shows us that the spark of the divine and the candle of life are hidden sometimes in the fields of suffering. And the fields of suffering are everywhere. Jesus, in Christian thinking, unites us to the divine. And his suffering does not eliminate our suffering, but it does give us the chance to think about it in a new way, to redefine what suffering means. Suffering can be a way of getting past our own petty world, our own little worlds, into something quite bigger, quite more wonderful than our own little worlds. And as we reflect upon the passion of Jesus, we see that achieving greatness is not about avoiding suffering, but rather about making life better for others, which is something that Jesus was all about. And this is what Jesus did. And in the final analysis, I would suggest that we're all connected, and therefore Jesus' suffering is my suffering. My suffering is Jesus' suffering. Paul writes about this regularly, how we participate in the suffering of Christ, and Christ participates in our suffering. Yours is mine, so it's not just vertical, it's also horizontal. Your suffering is my suffering, and my suffering is your suffering. All of our suffering belongs to all of us. It's a community, and it's only because we sometimes have trouble thinking like a community that we don't see that. Community, we all share in the joys and in the suffering of everyone. No one suffers alone, ultimately, even though they might be lonely. And God stands with all of creation in a celebration of all that is good, but as well, God stands in creation with all the suffering that happens there. In the face of gross injustice, the Galilean remains resolute and invites us to stand by his side, beside each other, beside every human being alive who has set themselves against the evil machinery of this world. And not only those who are alive today, but all those who have ever lived and all those who ever will live. And as we stand against the dehumanizing machinery of this world, we find that we are companions of the Galilean and partakers of his suffering. Despite how it so often feels, we never stand alone when we stand for justice, mercy, and love. Amen.